All right, good evening and welcome everybody to this meeting of Troy City Council. It's Tuesday, July 5th, 7 p.m. We'll begin with the invocation and the Pledge of Allegiance given by Mr. Phillips this evening. Please stand.
Should I salute you or the flag?
Whichever you. Please bow your head. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for allowing us to gather here today. Thank you for a safe weekend in our little community. And I want to have you praise the folks that take this community to their heart and put together the activities that everyone can witness and attend. They are true community-spirited folks. Please look after us as we make our decisions this evening and protect our city and our country and our globe. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Whidden.
Here.
Mr. Twist. Mrs. Snee.
Here.
Mr. Sievert.
Present.
Mr. Schilling.
Present.
Mr. Rozell.
Here.
Mr. Pierce.
Here.
Mr. Phillips.
Here.
Mrs. Marshall.
Here.
Move to excuse Mr. Twist.
Second. It has been moved by Mr. Sievert to excuse Mr. Twist, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Pierce.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall.
Yes.
Mr. Whidden.
Yes.
Mr. Twist is excused.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. We begin our proceedings tonight with an exciting public hearing on our 2023 tax budget, which I believe is part of Resolution R54, 2022. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the resolution?
Resolution adopting the budget of the City of Troy, Ohio for the fiscal year beginning January 1, 2023 and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. If anyone wishes to speak on the 2023 tax budget, now's the time to do it. Please come to the podium, give your name and address, and take as much time as you wish to consume on the 2023 tax budget. Seeing no one, we will declare the public hearing closed. Moving on to the summary minutes. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the minutes of the June 20th, 2022 meeting of Troy City Council?
Minutes of Council, June 20, 2022. A public hearing was held on ordinance number 031, a rezoning of 408 and 410 North Elm Street. At 7:05, Council recessed into executive session. At 7:44, Council returned to regular session. Committee reports. Building and Utilities Committee recommended legislation be prepared authorizing bidding for a sandblasting and painting project at the wastewater plant. Committee recommended legislation be prepared authorizing the Casstown Water Extension Project Engineering Fund Agreement. Community Partnerships Committee recommended the transfer of an ambulance to Edison State Community College and recommended legislation be prepared authorizing an administration agreement with Ohio Development Services regarding the CHIP program. Streets and Sidewalks Committee recommended legislation be prepared for the dedication of right-of-way along Arthur Road at South Dorset. The Personnel Committee reported regarding reappointments to city beautification, and which they were all approved. Resolution number R40, 2022, contract for Phase 14, Sidewalk Program, third reading and adopted. Resolution number R48, contract for the wastewater plant sandblasting and painting project, first reading and adopted. Resolution number R49. An agreement regarding the CHIP program, first reading and adopted. Resolution number R50, 2022, Casstown Water Extension Project. Funding agreement was given first reading and adopted. Resolution number R51, 2022, rejecting report of fact finder regarding IAFF, first reading and adopted. Ordinance 031, a rezoning on Elm Street, was given second reading. Ordinance number 032, dedication of right-of-way accepted, first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 033, declaring personal property of the city no longer needed so that the ambulance can be transferred to Edison State, first reading and adopted. Following comments, council adjourned at 8:13.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How's council wish to dispose of the minutes?
Motion to approve.
Second.
It's been moved to approve the minutes by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Rozell. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Seaver,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Minutes are approved.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. We have 4 committee reports this evening, all from the Community and Economic Development Committee, and Mr. Schilling. Mr. Schilling, go ahead.
Thank you, I appreciate that. This committee met on June 27th to consider the recommendation from the Troy Planning Commission that parcel D08-250712, located at 408 North Elm Street, and parcel D08-250710, located at 410 North Elm Street, be rezoned from R6 two-family residential district to OR1 office residential district. This committee supports the recommendation of the Troy Planning Commission regarding this proposed rezoning and recommends that council adopt ordinance number 031-2022. And this is respectively submitted by Mrs. Snee and myself, Jeff Schilling, as chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Schilling. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, please move on.
Okay, thank you. Okay, this committee again met on June 27th to consider an extension to the moratorium on the issuance of certificates of appropriateness to allow demolitions in the City of Troy Historic Preservation Overlay District. Proposed ordinance amendments should soon be forwarded to council from the Planning Commission. However, the time for council review will extend beyond the current moratorium. It is a recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing a moratorium extension of the 60 days commencing July 15th, 2022 on the acceptance of the new applications for certificates of appropriateness to allow demolitions except immediate demolitions related to public safety concerns in the City of Troy Historic Preservation Overlay District as discussed herein. Consideration of emergency legislation is supported so that there is no break in the time period of the moratorium. And again, this was respectfully submitted by Mr. Pierce, Mrs. Snee, and myself, Jeff Schilling, as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Schilling. Any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, please move on.
Okay. This committee met on June 27th to consider a memorandum of understanding, MOU, with the FOP OLC Troy Police Officers Association to create a police recruit position and provide for a lateral transfer recognizing the prior qualified service with another police agency for a new appointee. This will permit the city to be more competitive in recruiting and hiring qualified police officers. It is a recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to enter into a memorandum of understanding with the FOP OLC Troy Police Officers Association regarding lateral transfers for appointees with prior qualified service with another police agency and appoints a police at a police recruit pay, and to amend the safety ordinance related to the police officers to establish a police recruit position at the rate of $20 per hour for 2022. This committee supports emergency legislation so that the MOU can be executed without delay and the wage established. This was respectfully submitted by Mr. Pierce, Mrs. Snee, and myself, Jeff Schilling, as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Schilling. Any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, please move on for your last report.
Okay, thank you. This committee met on June 27th to consider a memorandum of understanding, MOU, with the Troy City Schools that would detail the arrangements for the city continuing to provide 3 sworn police officers as school resource officers during the school year, and the schools providing increased reimbursement to the city. It is a recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to enter into the School Resource Officer Memorandum of Understanding. This committee supports emergency legislation so that the MOU is in place for planning for the upcoming school year. And again, this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Pierce, Mrs. Snee, and myself, Jeff Schilling, as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Schilling. Any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, we'll move on to citizen comments for items on the agenda. We have 3 resolutions and 4 ordinances for discussion this evening. If you wish to address council on either of those resolutions or ordinances, you are invited to come to the podium, give your name and address, and you have 2 minutes to address council. Seeing none, we'll move on to resolutions and ask Mrs. Knight to please read the first resolution of the evening, Resolution R52, 2022.
Resolution number R52, 2022. Resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to enter into a memorandum of understanding, MOU, with the FOP OLC Troy Police Officers Association and declaring an emergency. This is the first reading.
Move for suspension.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the 3 reading rule by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
I will abstain from this one.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes. Move to adopt.
Second.
3 reading rule having been suspended, it has been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Sievert, seconded by Mrs. Snee. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Again, abstain.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the next resolution of the evening, Resolution R53, 2022?
Resolution number R53, 2022. Resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to enter into a school resource officer memorandum of understanding between the City of Troy and the Troy City Schools and declaring an emergency. This will provide the terms and conditions of the school resource officer program and the compensation of the schools. This is the first reading.
Motion to suspend the rules.
Second.
It's moved to suspend the 3 reading rule by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Rozell. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Pierce. Any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read Resolution R54, 2022?
Resolution number R54, 2022. Resolution adopting the budget of the City of Troy, Ohio for the fiscal year beginning January 1, 2023, and declaring an emergency. This is the adoption of the annual tax budget, which had a public hearing this evening, first reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the 3 reading rule by Mr. Rozell, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
3 reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Sievert, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. We are moving on to ordinances. I'll ask Mrs. Knight to read the first ordinance of the evening, Ordinance O31, 2022.
Ordinance number O31, 2022, an ordinance changing the zoning of parcel numbers D08 250712 and D08 250710 in the city of Troy, Ohio, from R6 2 Family Residential District to OR1 Office Residential District. These are located at 410 and 408 North Elm Street, have been recommended for approval by the Troy Planning Commission, and this is the third reading.
Move to adopt.
Second.
It has been moved by Mr. Seaver to adopt the ordinance, seconded by Mr. Phillips. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Abstain.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Whitten.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the next ordinance of the evening, ordinance 034, 2022?
Ordinance number 034, 2022. Ordinance extending for a period of 60 days the existing moratorium on the acceptance of new applications for certificates of appropriateness for the demolition or removal of a building or structure within the City of Troy Historic Preservation Overlay District and declaring an emergency. This is the first reading.
Does council wish to act?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It has been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Schilling, seconded by Mrs. Snead. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Sievert,
On suspension, yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It has been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Schilling, seconded by Mrs. Snead. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
No.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the next resolution of the evening? Ordinance of the evening, ordinance 035, 2022.
Ordinance number 035, 2022. Ordinance amending ordinance number 066, 2021, fixing salaries and wages of police officers of the City of Troy, Ohio, and declaring an emergency. This establishes the police recruit position and the hourly wage. This is the first reading.
Move for suspension.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Rozell. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Abstain.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
Three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Phillips,
Motion and second.
Mr. Whidden.
and seconded by Mr. Whitten. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Abstain.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the last ordinance of the evening? Ordinance 036, 2022.
Ordinance number 036, 2022. An ordinance changing the zoning of in-lot 11514 in the City of Troy, Ohio, from the Miami County zoning of R1 AAA, one-family residential, to the city zoning of R3 single-family residence district. This is the land known as the Camfarelli annexation, recently approved at 1322 Washington Road. First reading, this will have a public hearing at the next meeting.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight, and in consideration of a future public hearing, this will stand as the first reading of this ordinance. Moving on to communications and announcements. Mrs. Knight, are there any this evening?
No, sir.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Moving on to comments of officials, Mayor Oda.
Just wanted to say thank you to everybody who participated in the 4th of July events yesterday. It was a really good day. Grateful for that, for the concert, for the parade, and for the fireworks.
Thank you, Mayor. Director of Public Service Safety, Mr. Titterington.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have nothing tonight.
Thank you. Director of Law, Mr. Kerber.
I believe I'll defer to Mr. Friggy this evening. Thank you.
Setting the plate for our esteemed city auditor, Mr. Friggy. Do you have anything to say?
President and Mr. Kerr. I have nothing at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Friggy. Do any council members have any comments this evening?
Just to reiterate
Mr. Rozell?
that what Bobby said in the invocation and Robin said, for all the people that put the events on yesterday and worked many hours, I'm sure that they were great, and I think everybody enjoyed them.
Any other comments from council members?
I would,
Mr. Seaver?
I would set out to people to, or ask people, if you haven't already, to check out the Monarch Butterfly area. And you can go on the city website and you can see the bird feeders now, and the gazebo is up, the benches are up, the walking path is in. And so if you get the chance, come to the Monarch, go check out the Monarch Butterfly.
And where is that?
I'm sorry, what?
At Treasure Island.
Oh, it's at Treasure Island. It's to the north of the boathouse. So the
Little White Bridge.
little white bridge to the north of the boathouse, not towards the concert facility, but the other side.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Seaver. Any other council members have any comments? Do any staff members have any comments this evening? Do any residents have any comments this evening? You're invited to come up to the podium, give your name and address, and take as much time as you wish to consume.
Hi, I'm back. My name's Debbie Pike, and I live at 412 Eller Street in Troy. A few things I'd like to see if I could get it cleared up out here tonight. Who do I go to? I went to a person. That person told me nothing. So I'm hoping you guys can help me. I am very proud that East End of Troy is getting paved. Love it. Problem is, they have shut down Canal, they've shut down Williams, they have shut down Counts, they have shut down Long Street, Scott Street, Race Drive, every area. We have no place to park. So we called the phone number that the mayor had put on for us to contact, finally came back with, we'll go park on the agenda size. What side am I supposed to park on? I have 3 vehicles and 1 driveway. Am I supposed to park in my yard? And no one is answering this question. And I would like to know why it's not being answered. We are supposed to come to people. We are supposed to be able to open up to you people. I appreciate, Mayor, that you have contacted me through other issues. Love it, thank you very much.
And I believe the no parking starts tomorrow and runs
6 to
through
9.
Friday, I believe. Okay.
Yeah, July the 6th through the
Through the
9th.
9th.
So I'm not the only one that griping in our area,
Correct.
but I'm the only one that wants to come up and find out, where am I supposed to park at?
Do we have any guidance for Mrs. Pike?
Mrs. Pike, if you can give Sue your contact information, we'll have somebody call you bright and early tomorrow morning. Either the city engineer or the engineering tech who's in charge of the project.
Well, we tried to get hold, my son came up to do this because I had to work tonight. So then it's like, I'll be more than glad to give Sue, or Mrs. Knight, sorry, the information because I'm not the only one in my neighborhood. I mean, I love it that you are finally paving. Please don't get me wrong on that. But I want to know.
Okay.
And number 2 is I would like to understand why City of Troy does not open up the checkbooks. I'm back on the open checkbook. I think it's something for the citizens to do. I think it's time the city of Troy lays it all out. And I understand there are protocols. We shouldn't have to go protocol to come in and see something that we want to know now. You know, that is our money. Excuse me, it's all everybody's money, but it's my money, and I want to see how much money is being spent over here, and why isn't there somewhere that you could show where you get into grants, how much the grant is for, where that grant come from? I mean, I've been looking through, and I think it's time the citizens of Troy opens this check, well, the councils, or whoever's supposed to, because we never get a finance report unless we come to the meetings. Now, am I not wrong? Or am I not?
What I will say, Mrs. Pike, is that Mr. Pierce asked that this to be brought up in front of council. I have talked with a representative of the state treasurer's office today, and we are trying to get on his schedule. We have committee meetings on July 11th and July 25th. So I gave those 2 dates to the gentleman from the treasurer's office, saying, would you please do your best to be here one of those 2 dates? He has not confirmed those dates with me. But once we get a date confirmation, we will put it on the calendar. We will have a committee of the whole meeting where everyone around this table will have an opportunity to discuss it and hear the presentation from the state treasurer's office. So
Would there be, would there be a notice on that? Because I don't remember too much.
we will do what we traditionally do, put it in the newspaper.
Put it out on Facebook?
Mrs. Knight does a great job of letting the media know when things come up for discussion. So just keep your eyes peeled and your ears open. It will
I
become-
have been.
And, you know, even after the committee meeting, if something comes after that, it will have to come in front of council again. So there will be a meeting on that if there's something to talk about, so.
Well,
things are-
it's
things are
nice to
working.
know, Mr. Pierce, that you're stepping up there. So I thank you for all your time in answering those questions.
You're welcome, Mrs. Pike.
And I'll be waiting after the meeting. I'll give you my
Got a comment.
Ms. Pike?
Mr. Phillips. Yes, please, go ahead.
You said there are things that you would like to know.
Yeah.
Do you have a list of those things that you would like to know?
Oh, not with me.
If you would you make a list of those, and could you email them to me?
Sure,
Thank you.
no problem. Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you, Mrs. Pike. Anyone else wish to address council this evening? Please come forward, give your name and address, and take as much time as you wish to consume. Seeing none, we will adjourn this meeting. Thank you for attending this evening. Our next meeting will be Monday, July 18th at 7 p.m. Have a good evening, everyone.
Hey, Bobby, you asked that.